This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. A little best of this summer of 2022, August 2022, a little back to school on the way. My first guest, if you have a pulse, if you know something about psychology, Gerd Gigerenzer. Gerd is a brilliant guy, really awesome insights, some fantastic books that you got to check out, Risk Savvy being one of them. My second guest, a trader, a trend-following mindset, a trend-following trader, Robert Carver. Great insights. A Double Punch podcast. And again, as I often say, if you can't take something away from Gerd and Robert, if you can't learn something from these two men, you're done. I mean, go find a tent and live in Alaska and eat berries or something. Just give up. I mean, if you listen to Gerd and you listen to Robert and you take nothing away from their insights, you're toast. You can't handle modern society. Now, there might not be anything wrong with that. But you're just a lower IQ type. You don't really have much between the ears. That's okay. Completely okay. I'll come visit you while you pick berries in Alaska. Enough of my sarcasm, enough of my bullshitting. Let's jump right into Gerd Gigerenzer and Robert Carver. Hey, Gerd, how are you?
I'm fine. And where are you?
I'm in Saigon today.
In Saigon?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So,
what are you doing there?
Today, I'm just doing this fine podcast interview with you. But no, I've been spending the last probably 18 months in Asia at various different countries. Yeah. So living and working and back and forth to America as well.
Okay, that may be a very useful experience.
Absolutely. In fact, it makes you very aware of some of the subjects that you're talking about in your book, your newest book, Risk Savvy. You know, so it's let me jump right into that though. Let me. What I would love for you to explain for the audience is I know you have a good-natured collegial debate with Daniel Kahneman on his perspective, but I wonder if you could outline your perspective and perhaps the difference at how you both see the big picture.
Let's start with the commonalities. So we both believe that people use heuristics, that is, simple rules to make decisions, at least in many situations. The disagreement starts because Danny Kahneman and many of his followers believe that heuristics are always second best, and that statistics would always give you the right answer, and this is an error. In a world of uncertainty, where you cannot calculate all the risks, statistics and optimization doesn't help. I mean, it brings you to some point, but you never know what is the best solution. And in that kind of problems, heuristics can do very well, as we have shown. Not only do people use heuristics, but heuristics can often be better than so-called optimal. And that leads to a new perspective about heuristics, that they not only can describe how people make decisions, but also prescribe. That is a normative perspective of heuristics that poses the question, can we describe the environment, the situation, in which a simple heuristic, such as divide your money equally over the N assets, can outperform so-called optimization models. And this is the study of ecological rationality.
It is terribly fascinating. I thought there's some fantastic examples. People are definitely going to have to check out your book because we only have a few minutes here today, or at least 30, 40 minutes maybe to chat. But I thought there's some examples to really get people to understand your direction and where your research has gone. And one of the great ones in this new book is the notion of medical checkups. I can't tell you how many, even young people, they'll tell me, hey, I can go to this really cool hospital and I can get a full body scan, perfectly healthy 30-something-year-old person, and they're going to get full body scans looking for every possible thing that can go wrong. You're welcome to address that, but I would love for you to dig into the notion of the PSA test for men, because I do have a lot of men listeners, and frankly, a lot of men that perhaps are of the age where they need to at least ponder the idea of a PSA test. Why don't you talk about the issue of the medical checkup and that test, and that perhaps we've gone a little overboard?
Yeah. So part of my book is about situations where you can actually calculate the risks very clearly, and cancer screening is a good example for that. A PSA test is a test that is about early detection of prostate cancer. Now, in that situation, many Americans don't really think about whether they should participate in PSA testing or not. And rather follow a heuristic like, if you see a white coat, then, do whatever he or she is telling you. So the trusty doctor heuristic. That's a heuristic when doctors know the medical evidence, when doctors don't have conflicts of interest, and when they don't practice defensive decision-making, that is, they protect themselves against you as a potential plaintiff. None of these three conditions holds in the U.S. and also not in many other Western countries. So that means the heuristic trust your doctor is not ecologically rational. And here you need to think yourself. The evidence for PSA tests is quite clear. We do not have evidence that lives are saved. There's a little controversy on whether PSA testing reduces mortality from prostate cancer, maybe 1 in 1,000 or maybe it's 0 in 1,000, but in total mortality and in total cancer mortality, there's no evidence that there's any difference. But the consequence of this test can be terrible for many men. For instance, most men who have prostate cancer, and that's quite frequent. The older you get, and if you're lucky to live a long life, you almost certainly have some form of prostate cancer. Say 80% of 80-year-olds have some form of prostate cancer, but only 3% die from prostate cancer. So if everyone goes screening and the condition is detected, most of these cancers are only technically cancer, but are not clinically relevant. You die with the cancer, not from the cancer. So, and then there's treatment, and maybe half or so of men being treated end up incontinent for the rest of their lives and impotent in addition. So this is why the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force recommends against routine prostate cancer screening. Nevertheless, many doctors and clinics recommend prostate cancer screening. And this is for one of these three reasons. Many doctors we have studied don't know the medical evidence. Second, they have conflicts of interest. So clinics earn money from doing the tests and more money from the consequences, the surgery, which is, as I said, often unnecessary surgery. And third, there are conflicts, there's defensive decision-making. So many doctors who themselves would never take a PSA test recommend the PSA test to their patients because they want to protect themselves against the patient as the potential plaintiffs. to deal with the situation that eventually most men who get old get some kind of prostate cancer and then might sue the doctor for not having done the PSA test. So this is a very interesting situation. And we develop so-called fact boxes that actually have been originally developed by Lisa Schwartz and Stephen Woloshin in Dartmouth College, and have made their way into the Obama healthcare law, but they're never being published. And that is what I think one of the big tools in healthcare to help doctors and patients understand what the medical evidence is. So such a fact box just shows you by using icons like smiling faces and sad faces what happens to 100 men who participate in PSA tests and those who don't 10 years later. And then you can see in mortality, no life is saved, but about 20 of every 100 men suffer from taking the tests, either by having false positives and unnecessary biopsies, or by having actually a non-progressive version of prostate cancer and being treated unnecessarily.
I think you're getting at the heart of what risk savvy is all about, is that when you're going to take risks, do you follow your instincts or is it expert advice? Instincts or expert advice? Gut or expert advice? That's what it comes down to, doesn't it?
Yeah, and with expert advice, you need to be very careful because you need to analyze whether these situations, the conditions that I just mentioned hold, whether the expert knows the evidence, whether there is conflict of interest. The expert may make a choice between giving you the best advice and losing money, and defensive decision-making. On PSA, the man who discovered PSA, Richard Ablin, recently said that no man should routinely take PSA tests. And he ended up saying that I never dreamed, that's a quotation, that my discovery 4 decades ago would lead to such a profit-driven public health disaster. Yeah. And it's here what I mean, what risk savvy is about, to learn to make informed decisions and also to relax with your anxieties and take the remote control of your emotions with it, again, in your own hands.
You know, one of the things that you've brought up in this work, Gerd, too, in your other work is the big question. What is the absolute risk increase? And I have a personal example that I'd like to share with you. So there was a debate online between groups of people that were traveling a lot. They were debating traffic fatalities in the United States versus Thailand. And it was 38 per 100,000 in Thailand are killed, and 11 per 100,000 in the United States are killed. And some people immediately read that and said, oh my gosh, it's 4 times more dangerous to drive in Thailand. And I was like, but hold on, the absolute numbers are pretty close, 38 to 11. It's per 100,000 people. So it seemed like to me a classic example of looking at the relative comparison and not thinking about the absolute risk.
That's a well-known trick, so, to use relative numbers when absolute numbers would give you a very different picture. And the same trick is used, for instance, in cancer screening, where to take another example, take mammography screening. What we know is that out of 1,000 women age 50 who don't participate in screening, 10 years later, about 5 of them die from breast cancer. And among 1,000 women who participate in screening, that's 4. So the reduction is from 5 to 4 out of every 1,000, or in other words, 1 out of 1,000. But that's usually not told to women, but they learn that breast cancer screening reduces mortality from breast cancer by 20%, from 5 to 4 in 1,000, often rounded up to 30 or 35%. I've analyzed the brochures. So, the latter has been typical in the UK. In the US, most brochures don't give even numbers because the assumption is that women are frightened of numbers, or maybe they're innumerate, or whatever the assumption is. So American women, most of the time, get no numbers at all about the benefit. They get other numbers that are irrelevant, but not about the benefit. So here we have another case where relative numbers are used to evoke or to mislead people about the benefit of medication. Another example is the Lipitor advertisement that if you take Lipitor or another cholesterol-reducing drug, then you reduce your risk of a stroke by 50%. Isn't that good, 50%? The studies show that out of 100 men or women who are already at high risk because otherwise there's no evidence that these drugs help at all, out of 100 high-risk persons who don't take the drug, so 2 get a stroke, and that reduces to 1. So that's the effect. 50% is the same as 1 percentage point. So here we have, these are simple tools that everyone could learn. Always ask, what's the absolute risk? And don't listen or get impressed by relative numbers.
Hey, Gerd, let me ask you to go in a slightly different direction, which is the notion of romance and getting married. And I'll have to tell you how you were on my show last year, but I was in a bookstore in Singapore and I was with my girlfriend. And I looked up and I saw your book there and I said, oh, this is a really interesting guy. He was on my podcast last year. I picked up the book. Now, mind you, this is girlfriend, not married. I pick up the book and I open it. And the very first page I open to is the Benjamin Franklin part talking about building a ledger. And so I started laughing to myself. I was like, oh my gosh, I'm not sure what's going on here. How did this just happen? And so I had to read her the passage. But anyways, why don't you explain what Franklin's thinking was in the ledger and maybe talk about some of the heuristics that apply and have been successful in the notion of romance?
Okay, so Benjamin Franklin, he gave the recipe how to make rational decisions. And it's basically the pro and contra list. And that what later became what every business school or economics school teaches, the maximization of expected utility. In a famous letter to his nephew, he explains him to how, if in doubt, set down all the reasons pro and con, and so on, and weigh them. And then he ends, by the way, if you do not learn it, I apprehend you will never be married. So this is now the received theory. So I have nothing against adding and weighing and pros and cons lists, but they work in a world where you can foresee, you can predict the future very well, in a world of known risk, but not so much in the world of unknown risk, and that in relationships, all kind of things happen that you never foresaw. And I also have asked many of my friends who are economists, mostly men, how they made their own decision about whom to marry. The universal answer was, no, we didn't follow our own theory. I found only one economist who said, of course, I followed my own theory. And he told me that he listed all the alternatives, all the consequences, such as, will you let me work in peace and take care of the children, and then he estimated the probabilities for each of these women that this will actually happen, multiplied it by the utilities, and made the calculation and proposed to the women with the highest expected utility. She accepted. He never told her how to do it. Now they're divorced, but that happens to many people. And some people may laugh about that, but think for a moment. The problem that expected utility theory maximization is proposed as the recipe for everything, for every decision. It's basically statistics, as if statistics would be the answer to everything. Statistics is an enormous important tool, but it works in situations where you can actually be sure that you can predict the world very well. Another thing is modern dating sites use this kind of algorithm for matching partners. and weighing hundreds of personality characteristics for the perfect date. I mean, that makes me shudder, because it's, how would you be able to predict that? And I would bet that these modern dating sites will not have more success than even the classical way, where someone experienced, who knows you very well, would have made the decision for you, as it's still the case in many Asian countries.
Yeah.
And there is certainly no evidence that these dating site algorithms lead to romantic relations that are superior to traditional ways of finding partners and lead to kissing fewer frogs.
Well, I think not only is it perhaps crazy that there's a prediction that this can work, maybe it's even more interesting that people actually believe in it.
There is a big movement, and now you're back to the original topic. There's a big movement towards replacing good judgment by algorithms and mistrusting intuitions and good gut feelings. And that's what part of behavioral economics is about. That's what part of the heuristics and biases program is about. You find the statement that human intuition is sometimes good but sometimes bad, which is true, of course. But the statistical optimization models are also sometimes good and sometimes bad. And I think the last financial crisis had made that very clear, that the algorithms of the rating agencies, the value at risk computations that the banks used, created illusions of certainty and prevented no single crisis and predicted none. So we need to think more about a toolbox and not one tool, one hammer that's always right, and human intuition is always wrong. That's a big error.
One of the things that I loved in the book as well, you make the point, if an experienced person with a good track record has a strong hunch about a decision, listen to him or her and don't just demand facts.
I've worked with many large companies and asked the managers from through the entire hierarchy into the executive committee, how often is an important professional decision where you're taking part? Usually they don't do it alone, but in groups. How often is this decision a gut decision? If you do these confidential interviews, you get the answer that about every other decision is at the end a gut decision. And a gut decision is not caprice, not something arbitrary, not a sixth sense or God's insight, but it's a form of unconscious intelligence. So these managers have long time experience. And usually they are buried under a mountain of data, partially contradicting. And then and there's no algorithm to decide whether you should establish a branch in Saigon or not. But if they have a feeling based on their experience where they go, that's a gut decision. And in about half of important decisions in large companies, it's intuition at the end that counts. That means the decision makers can't explain it. But they would never admit to this in public because there's fear of intuition. Because if you make a gut decision, you take the responsibility. And I've observed that in large companies, there are two ways to deal with this anxiety of gut decisions. One is to find reasons after the fact. So an employee is sent to find reasons in the next 2 weeks, and then the decision is presented as a fact-based decision. Or the more expensive version is you hire a consulting firm that finds reasons and presents a 200-page document with PowerPoint. This is all a waste of time, of intelligence, and money, because people have fear to make good intuitive decisions. And one of the reasons is the literature in behavioral economics, in other fields, where people learn that intuitive decisions are suspect. You should mistrust them, and you should trust blindly into logic and probability theory.
Another great example that I think you bring up in your book, that the notion of being risk savvy, upscale restaurants and in ordering, and what's the best way to order food in an upscale restaurant?
Yeah. So I have learned myself from studying risk-taking in the real world to make decisions faster and more relaxed. So when I'm in an upscale restaurant, and I'm often ending up there after giving a talk, one of the heuristics is I don't even open the menu, but I ask the waiter what he or she would eat this evening here. I don't ask the waiter what she would recommend me, because then she would start to think, oh, that's a German guy, what do Germans eat? And I'm a wrong way. And in a good restaurant, the waiter knows what's happening in the kitchen and what's best today. And I've never regretted this kind of decision. And it leaves you time for conversation. And while many of my dear friends, they cannot not open a menu, and they try to maximize, go through everything and every other piece and every word. And then they often end up with something which is really second best.
It's a great tip, though. It's a great piece of insight.
And it's a simple heuristic. It just illustrates there are many of these heuristics where you actually usually are better off than trying to maximize.
You know, Gert, one last thing here to expand on, which I think is a really big picture point. And this isn't meant to be a knock at anybody else in the field or anything, but I've seen you say that you viewed risk savvy as an alternative to a flood of popular books that say we're foolish and irrational and that there's not much that can be done about us. But you seem to be making a case in our brief conversation today that there are ways with smart gut judgments that you can navigate much more effective.
Yes. I mean, the risk savvy is what I think the alternative to the view that we are hopeless in taking risks and need to be nudged by governments or other authorities into better behavior. This is not my view of a democracy or of the 21st century. It's old-fashioned paternalism. And also a kind of view of humans as it's more Homo Simpsons. So we have shown that in order to be risk-savvy, you need basically two kind of tools. If the situation is one where you can calculate the risk, then you need statistical thinking. And we have shown that despite the flood of publications in the heuristics and biases tradition that try to show again and again that people seem to fail some standards, that we can teach already fourth graders to do complicated statistical inferences that are called Bayesian inference. And most of the fourth graders that we have studied in Germany, in China, can learn this in a blink. While, for instance, Danny Kahneman, still in his book Thinking Fast and Slow, believes or claims that people would basically not be able to do this because of some mystical system one, or as Thaler and Sunstein in the book Nudge claim that they compare these so-called illusions like the base rate fallacy to visual illusions as suggesting that nobody could unlearn them. This is a big error. And in situation where one cannot calculate the risk, one needs good heuristics. Both of these tools is what can make people risk savvy. That doesn't mean that one always makes the best decision, simply because in a world of uncertainty, nobody can know ahead what the best decision will be. But in general, I see my book Risk Savvy also as a political statement for the 21st century, that we should invest more in people rather than blaming them and trying to find ways to nudge them. For instance, many of my colleagues think it's impossible to educate people out of their so-called cognitive illusions. Just think ahead, a few centuries ago, few people would have believed that we can ever succeed to teach everyone how to read and to write. The 20th century has managed this in the Western countries. And in the same way, I would bet any money I have that if we only try, we can teach everyone to become risk savvy. And we have shown this at a very young age, and we even can teach doctors to understand medical evidence. I have trained American U.S. federal judges and lawyers in understanding DNA evidence. They all can learn that. There's nothing inborn, misfired in our brain. We have problems, more problems in some ways, but we often can find good representations to understand risks better.
You know, one of the things, and I'll leave you with this, Gerd, one of the things that I love about your work as a former baseball player is the gaze heuristic. But I was thinking even a derivative of that type of heuristic. I used to be a baseball catcher. So let's say the pitcher's throwing the ball in, there's a man on first base, and he's attempting to steal. So we can think of the numbers of calculations going on here. A pitcher's throwing the ball 90 miles an hour. The guy is running from first to second as hard as he can, and I have to catch the ball and throw it down, 120 some odd feet to hopefully get him out. There's so many things going on there, but you don't think about it. You just, you stand up, you see the glove down there at second base, and you throw the ball, and you throw it as hard as you can, try to hit the glove. But you don't do all the trajectories and the calculations in your brain. It's a heuristic of just playing the sport and playing the game.
That's correct. The gaze heuristic is one heuristic that baseball players and also cricket players and soccer goalies use. And the point is that usually people think this is a complex problem, how to catch a ball, so we need a complex solution. What would be the complex solution be? Somehow the unconscious calculates the trajectory of the ball by solving differential equations. And a number of experts have shown that experienced baseball players do something very different. So the gaze heuristic is one of the heuristics they use that works if the ball is already high up in the air. And you just fixate the ball, second start running, and third, adjust your running speed so that the angle of gaze remains constant. And then you end up there where the ball is coming down. This heuristic can ignore all the information that you would need to calculate the trajectory, including wind, spin, the original distance the ball was kicked or thrown, and so on. And it focuses only on one good reason, which is the angle of gaze. So complex problems can often be solved by simple heuristics. In this case, by just focusing on the one important piece and ignoring the rest.
Well, Gerd, I highly recommend the book Risk Savvy. Everyone can find it on every Amazon site around the world or their local bookstores. What bookstores are still left, but Amazon is going to have it everywhere. And and also the Max Planck Institute, they can find additional work about you there as well, correct?
Okay. Michael, it was a pleasure to talk to you.
Absolutely. I hopefully can do this maybe once a year, Gerd. I appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Take care. My guest today is Robert Carver. Robert is based in London. He has quite a bit of systems trading experience. His book is called Systematic Trading, can be found everywhere. Robert is formerly with Barclays Bank and with AHL, the famed trend-following manager, founded by David Harding, Martin Luke, etc. Robert brings some really down-to-earth systems trading perspective. If you are new or if you are experienced, I guarantee Robert will illuminate some of the most important systems trading issues that there are. There are no secrets. There is no black box. There is no magic. But there is common sense. I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Robert Carver. Robert, as I was getting ready to talk to you today, and I'm going through your work, and everything's extremely detailed, but I'm thinking, when did this man start with the word system? Where was he? How old was he? What environment was he in? What understanding did he have of money and markets before the word system came into your life? And when did that happen? How did it happen?
So I was pretty early on in my financial career, actually. So I did a few things early on in my life, which I never ended up continuing with. And then at the age of 24, I decided to go back to school, get my university degree. And it was in my final year of university that I did an internship with a quantitative trading firm called AHL. So that was the first time I began thinking about trading in a systematic way. It was before I'd worked in an investment bank or traded my own money or done any of those things that other people may have done earlier in their lives. So systematic trading has been really a part of my thinking in my life from a relatively early age, so from my late 20s, and in terms of my investment career, almost day zero, really.
At what point in time were you at AHL?
So I did an internship there in the summer of 2001. And then I went back to school, finished my final year. I worked for an investment bank for a couple of years. So did the other kind of trading, what I like to call discretionary trading. Did a couple of years working in an economic research centre and just sort of developing my quantitative skills there. And then I came back to AHL in 2006. And I was there from 2006 to 2013, which obviously were pretty exciting and pretty scary years to be working in finance.
Before I go into some of that 2008 time period, the crisis, you've got a lot of interesting experiences at that moment in time, things that you saw firsthand. But I'd like to dig a little deeper on the word system, and that when you got to AHL as part of your university program, what did you understand? I mean, was there a particular person or was there a particular event that took place where the system was put across your desk, so to speak, the word, and you had this light bulb moment? Was there ever a moment, or was it all very gradual?
I would say it was gradual, and as I said, I've never really thought about finance in any way apart from a very systematic way. And one of the reasons I think I found it difficult in the investment bank environment, where the trading we were doing seemed to be mostly on hunches or sort of seat of the pants stuff. I found that quite difficult. So I'm much more of a kind of person who's very comfortable with numbers, who's very comfortable with a very formal way of doing things, who is very comfortable with using an algorithm to sort of decide what your thought process should be.
I want to read something really quick. This is from the opening of your work, Systematic Trading. You're quoting Daniel Kahneman. I think it's a great quote to set the tone for our conversation today. Quote, "In every case, the accuracy of experts was matched or exceeded by a simple algorithm. Why are experts inferior to algorithms? One reason is that experts try to be clever, think outside the box, and consider complex combinations of features in making their predictions. Complexity may work in the odd case, but more often than not, it reduces validity." End quote. That's Daniel Kahneman, Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow. That is such a perfect way to sum up the direction that you like to go. Obviously, I relate to where you like to go as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if I have one sort of overriding message, is that I personally think most people are not as good at trading as they think they are. Ironically, as you say, it's the people who think of themselves as experts, who have a lot of knowledge and a lot of experience and have spent a lot of time trading, who are more likely to be overconfident and overestimate their ability. I think people rarely actually sort of evaluate themselves critically and actually properly work out how well they've done in their discretionary trading activity and look at statistics properly to really examine whether they genuinely are doing much better than a system. I think a lot of people out there are probably fooling themselves, and they would actually do a lot better with a simple system. Don't get me wrong, I think there are some incredibly good traders out there, but I think they make up a very small fraction of the population of people who are involved in finance. And for the vast majority of what I think of as ordinary people, and I include myself in that, people who aren't these rare geniuses, then just using a system is definitely the way to go.
You talk about the self-critical aspect, and as before we get into your definition of a system, I was thinking, here I am, home for the holidays, so to speak, around family and friends. And I think most people can relate to this. If you haven't been around for a while and you see a lot of people that you've known for a long time, often they're bigger than when you saw them last time. And what's amazing is the self-image hasn't changed at all. They're still Olympic champions. They're still running the 10-second 100 meters. They have no perspective and no measuring ability of what's happening to them personally. And they're still in this state of not measuring, so to speak.
Absolutely. I mean, I got back on my bike today after a couple of weeks just eating and drinking and getting fat, as you say. And it was I thought I was doing okay. And then I came home and sort of downloaded the statistics from my ride and was quite shocked to discover how unfit I'd become in just a couple of weeks when I actually looked at the statistics.
Measuring and counting does a lot for our lives, whether it's exercise or investing. Let me jump into system, because I've talked about this a lot in my podcast, but I think sometimes when I talk to new people and people with different perspectives and you go very in depth into your work, how do you define a system, a trading system in the investing world? How do you look at it?
I think there's some key words that I need to think about here. So a system must be objective. It must be repeatable. It must be transferable. So you talk to a lot of people, particularly from what I call the sort of older tradition of pattern matching in technical analysis. These guys look at charts and they see patterns in those charts. And they claim to be systems traders because it's only when they see these patterns that they will actually trade. The problem is if you get them to write down an objective rule that can be formalized and turned into a computer algorithm, or even just written down sufficiently well that someone else without any experience of that could identify these same patterns, they seem unable to do it. So that suggests that what they're doing isn't really systematic. Maybe a little bit systematic. They're not just throwing darts at a dartboard, but it's not completely objective. It's not transferable to another person. And it may not even be repeatable by the same person. So they may see slightly different patterns on different days and say, oh yeah, that's a buy, that's a sell. But, they're not applying a completely objective rule that you could formalize in an algorithm and therefore get the same results every time. So if you're not going to get the same results with a different person using your system, if you're not going to get the same results yourself when you use it every time on different days, then you're not really a systems trader, in my opinion.
I had someone email me the other day, and they were talking about a price action-based system. And the follow-up question was, but I need to use charts, right? So here they were right in the middle of going down the right path, but there was still this pull to the lure of chart reading that you just talked about. It's a definite confusion point, and I'm sure you found this confusion in your career trying to get people to understand your objective, systematic way versus what many people, they're first thrown into the Bloomberg or CNBC expert that comes on TV and says, well, this pattern indicates that XYZ market will be here in 2 years. I tend to think when people are in that I want to read charts phase, they really want to get to where you are. They just don't see the difference yet.
Absolutely. And I think part of the problem is that this illusion of overconfidence. There's this view that you need to be an expert to do a good job. If you can write down what you're doing so that it's perhaps just 2 or 3 lines of code or 2 or 3 simple steps or a spreadsheet with just half a dozen columns, then there's the view that can't possibly be any good because it's too simple. It's not, it doesn't have enough expertise in it. It's not something that you need 10 or 20 years of staring at charts to be able to do. And so there's this view that people have that it can't possibly be any good, it can't possibly work. And, the more complicated and the weirder and the more subjective the patterns are, the better, because then the logic is that you're going to be one of a small number of people that can actually do this, and therefore you're more likely to make more money. And it's not a view I sign up to at all, unfortunately.
Robert, why do you think, for those skeptics out there, perhaps those that have made it to the I want to read charts phase, why do you think those skeptics don't find themselves eventually looking for evidence? Now, there's no guarantee that past performance is going to dictate the future, but it is quite interesting to look at some of the systematic traders over the decades, and easily over the decades, to look at their month-by-month performance. And there's something that can be gleaned from that. There's success, confidence, etc. Why do you think people don't sometimes make the leap to look for evidence when the evidence really is hiding in plain sight?
I think part of the problem is that most people can't really judge what is good evidence and what is bad evidence. So most people don't have a good intuitive understanding of concepts of statistical significance. So if you were to ask somebody, what constitutes a track record that's long enough to make a judgment such that you know that a particular fund manager or a particular trader or a particular trading system isn't just making money through luck, but is actually adding value, and you assign a probability like, say, 95%. So you want to be 95% sure that this isn't just a fluke. And most people will massively underestimate the amount of time and the amount of data you need to actually make that judgment. In practice, unless the trader is highly skilled or the trading system is incredibly good, and I'm now talking about the sort of returns that high-frequency trading firms can push out. Unless you're in that realm, you do need an awful lot of history, and I'm talking about multiple decades of history. And now when I analyse trading systems, I've normally got just about enough data to make a judgment that a particular system, is probably, well, at least was profitable in the past, because, as you say, there's no guarantee the future will repeat itself. But an individual trader, unless they've been in the game for an awfully long time, and unless their trading style hasn't changed so that, they're doing the same thing they were doing 30 years ago, and so they can use all of their data, it's very unlikely to be in a position to actually say, yes, I'm not just lucky, I am actually good. So most people confuse luck with skill. And I think that's part of the problem, because it's very easy to get into the game of just looking at charts, and you've got a pretty good chance of even if you were just throwing darts at a dartboard, or even if there were no value in these charts at all, you've got a pretty good chance of being one of the people who manages to make some money in the first couple of years of trading. And then it's going to be very hard to step back from that and say, well, actually, I'm doing something that really isn't going to add any value, because you're probably not going to have enough evidence that that's the case or is the case. And so you've got the natural tendency of people to view themselves as being much better traders than they've been, and to ascribe the fact that they've made some money for a couple of years to some skill or some ability to read these charts.
Let's break apart systematic trading across the different time frames. You mentioned high-frequency trading. Let's say that's on one extreme, and then maybe a very slow form of trend following on the other extreme. Both of these strategies can be made systematic, but they're quite different. That difference is often lost on many investors, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, most people, if you talk to them and tell them that you're a systematic trader, they assume you're what is often called an algorithmic trader, which means you're very much at the short time period, the extreme of the high-frequency traders who are holding positions for tiny fractions of a second. It is quite hard to get across that you need a completely different mindset to trade systematically in these different areas. If we take some famous people like, say, David Harding, who runs Winton, but obviously was also one of the co-founders of AHL. He's a very smart guy and a very able guy. And then you've got someone like, I think his name is Usweet, who runs IMC, which is a Dutch high-frequency trading firm. Again, a very successful guy. And both of these guys are dollar billionaires, so they've done pretty well in their chosen field. But if you were to swap them around and get them to run each other's strategies, I think they would struggle, because it is a completely different world. I have almost no conception of what the high-frequency guys do. They use techniques which would make no sense at all in the lower frequency world, because they have a lot more statistical data to look at, whereas the very low frequency trend following, perhaps kind of tactical asset allocation models, you really don't have as much data, and you need to have a much better handle on running strategies that make a kind of economic or intuitive sense, rather than just being a set of weird non-linear patterns that appear in some short-term data.
But what's amazing is even though they can both be so different, they might be completely lost if they switched places. The commonalities, the reasons why they have, and I started with that Daniel Kahneman quote, the reasons why they have put themselves, their companies, into a systematic approach. This goes back to Kahneman's work, doesn't it? This is gets right at the psychology level, the human behavior level of all of us. We're not exactly rational, and there's some very common sense reasons for systems to work and to stick to them, whether it's high frequency or trend following.
Exactly. I mean, it's definitely the case that the most successful systematic traders are those that are running systems that make some kind of sense. And that might be, the high frequency area that, you make sense because you're essentially being paid to provide liquidity in the market, whether that be implicitly through the bid-ask spread, or whether it be through, rebates in the US equity markets, or these sort of dark pool things that are going on. And then, going back to the sort of slower trend following, there's all kinds of theories and explanations as to why trend following has worked in the past, and I personally believe will work in the future. One of my favorites is behavioral finance theory called prospect theory, which was developed by Kahneman, his co-author, and that essentially relates to the way that people treat realized gains and realized losses differently. And that's a really neat little theory that essentially explains why people really struggle to invest in trend following strategies, and therefore why those are profitable to computers that don't suffer from these emotional faults. And the second aspect that people at both ends of the spectrum have is that they stick to their systems, they believe in them. In the high frequency world, well, you don't really have much choice. You're trading so quickly that as a human being, you can't really sort of step in and try and meddle with what the system's doing. It has to run, fully automatically. As a slower systematic trader, it's more tempting to meddle with the system, to change parameters or override it in certain situations. That's more of a danger. But I do believe you'll be more successful if you can avoid the temptation of doing that.
Let's go ahead and break this apart a little bit. You've got a great story in your book, leaving the hedge fund industry at one point in time, and you visited a shop and you called it Aqueduct Capital. Why don't you relay that story? I thought that was some nice color for people that do have an understanding of what a system is and perhaps are trying to test it and come up with a belief in their system. I thought that little story of visiting Aqueduct Capital was really enlightening.
Shortly after leaving the hedge fund industry, I began discussions about consulting and managing some capital for Aqueduct Capital, a local proprietary trading firm. The office contained the usual mixture of grizzled ex-life traders and naive youths, all day trading a handful of futures contracts. But the boss was particularly proud of his quantitative team, which consisted of a couple of 20-somethings, toting PCs running an off-the-shelf backtesting software package. "This is Joe. He's only been here a month, and he's already come up with 50 new trading rules that are profitable in backtest," explained the boss. "Yes, this software is amazing. It can automatically test hundreds of rules a day," added Joe. I managed to keep a straight face and reply as diplomatically as I could, "Well, I'm sure some of them will work."
You walk into the room and there's all this excitement. We've got the latest and greatest backtesting software. We've got some floor veterans. We've got some bright-eyed 20-something millennials. Everyone's ready to go. And my gosh, in a few minutes, we backtested a few things, and man, we figured it all out. Now, of course, on our limited time today, and I highly, highly implore people to take a look at your book, Systematic Trading, we definitely can't dig into all of the elements here, but in terms of broad brushstrokes, help people to understand what you were feeling, even though you diplomatically, in a very British way, didn't say what you were really feeling.
Yeah, I mean, part of the reason why this story is kind of rings a bell with me is that I've done it myself, although not to the same degree. I think it's very tempting when you get hold of some backtesting software and you have some good ideas to start playing with it and see what happens. So there's kind of a couple of things going wrong here. So the first is a very easy thing to understand, which is that essentially you're cheating. You're using a time machine. If you run a backtest over all the data that you've got, and then look at the results, and then decide, you know what, this model is good, I'm going to keep it, or this model is bad, I'm not going to keep it, then you're doing something that you couldn't have done had you been sent back into the past to 1975, say, when your backtest begins. You wouldn't then have been in a position where you had this 40 years of data available to decide which model was good and which model was bad. You would just have had to run those two models together over time, and then over time you would have gradually worked out which models seem to be doing better than the other. The second problem is that, and it's just kind of pure statistics really, if you test a lot of different trading strategies, even if on average they're all bad, some of them will look good for a given time period. And then this is just kind of the law of random numbers, if you like. Just as an example, let's suppose that you're going to be quite strict and say, well, I want to see something that has at least a Sharpe ratio of 1 in the back test before I even consider it. And so you then test 100 different rules, which sounds like a lot, but a lot of these packages, that's very easy to do, and they're probably not going to be 100 completely different rules. They're probably just going to be 100 variations on the theme with slightly different parameters. Now, on average, with 100 rules and a minimum Sharpe ratio of 1, 16 of those rules, so that's nearly 1/5 of those rules, will look as if they're good, even though in actuality none of them actually profitable. It's just luck that 16 of them have, over your backtest period, happen to work pretty well. And this problem gets exponentially worse, and you have to reduce the number of rules you look at quite considerably before you get to the point where you're not going to have this element where even a bad rule is going to kind of slip through your net just by luck, just by the fact you've looked at so many different rules. So the lesson here really is that you've got to be ever so strict at trying to avoid looking at all of your data. And secondly, that you've got to try and reduce the number of variations or parameters that you look at. And I personally believe if you have an idea that you think is going to work and you try it, then one of two things will happen. Either the back test looks bad, and it's very hard then to say, my idea was really bad, particularly when you're working for somebody else and they're expecting some return on the salary they're paying you. It's very tempting to spend time polishing it and changing the parameters and adding overlays and just generally messing around until you manage to improve the thing so that it looks good in the back test. You're just fooling yourself. And the other alternative, which is nearly as bad, is if you have a rule that works well in the back test, is just to try and improve it a bit more. And again, all these changes you make will improve the performance of back test, but will make it quite likely that you've overfitted the thing. And then when you actually trade it with real money, although it was actually probably a sensible idea, you'll have completely destroyed the performance of it in actual trading.
As one sits down to put together a system for the first time, and I'm curious how you felt when you walked into, quote, Aqueduct Capital, talk about the advantages of ideas first in system building, the advantages of data first, and how were you feeling when you walked into Aqueduct? Were you looking at that as a data-only backtesting development, or were you thinking they actually had some ideas? But talk about the difference between ideas and data and the complexity behind that, because it's not necessarily an easy choice, is it?
No, so these are the two labels I use for the two main ways that people come up with trading systems, trading rules. Data first is what most people, I think, imagine you do as a systematic trader. And this is becoming an increasingly common perception as things like machine learning and neural networks and big data are all very kind of fashionable at the moment. People assume that what you do is you get all your price data and you drop it into some kind of giant optimizing machine, and out will pop a trading rule that will give you a good profitable account curve in all those data points. Now that data rule may not make any sense at all. It might be something like, if the S&P 500 is down on a Tuesday and, the moon is full, then buy pork bellies on Thursday. It could be something as random as that. And it may be actually, it may actually be a good rule. It may work. There may be some weird thing going on that means that rule works. There may be some investor who, for whatever reason, does big trades in those markets and makes the thing work. And if you look at someone like Jim Simons at Renaissance Capital, he's really been doing this very strange, non-linear trading rules for a very long time and very successfully. But that doesn't mean to say that its approach will work for everybody, because you need to be incredibly careful about things like statistical significance. You need to use some fairly sophisticated techniques. The alternative, which I call ideas first, is where you begin with an idea. So the idea could be kind of economically based. So it could be something like, well, central banks set interest rates according to unemployment levels and inflation. So I'm going to build a model which will bet on interest rates rising if inflation is rising and unemployment is falling, and vice versa. Or it could be based around a behaviour. So if you think that trend following works for whatever reason, then you can build a trend following model. Then once you have your idea and you build a rule that embodies that idea, you then go ahead and test it. So the important thing is, in both cases, you have to test it and make sure that you've got something that works. But with the ideas first, you have the additional validation that you know why it works. I like having that extra confirmation, that extra tick. I'm much more comfortable and happy running a model and seeing it, especially if it's losing money, understanding why it's losing money. It's just because that particular effect isn't working at the moment. Whereas if it's the weird thing where, you've got S&P 500 and pork bellies, because I don't really understand where that trading strategy came from, I'm not necessarily going to understand why it's losing money. And it'd be much harder for me to stick to the plan and just trade that as it is. When I kind of see people who are using data first techniques and using them in a bad way, it's kind of depressing. I'm not saying both approaches work. They work better in different scenarios. So data first seems to work better for faster trading. Ideas first seems to work better for slower trading because there's just less data to work with. But generally speaking, I've seen much more misuse and really bad system design done by people who've just started with some data and then analysed it without really thinking about what's going on in the market and what the kind of underlying idea of their trading system is.
I want to take a side step for a moment and go back in time. And I'm going to come back to my next serious subject on this would be risk. I want to dive headlong into it. But I would love for you to go back to the 08, 09 time period. I was going to ask you earlier, and I want to come back to that. The most interesting experience that you saw in the catbird seat that you were in for your life, the lesson that changed you during that, I guess, that fall of 08, early 09 time period. What were you seeing on the ground from your perspective that really changed you? And how did that embolden you to the concept of a system, to the idea of using a system and being religious with that system?
I think what the crisis of 08 and 09 really taught me was that people often don't know what's coming. We're really bad at predicting the future. There were a small number of people who saw the credit crisis coming, and famously people like John Paulson, and who also managed to place bets in the market and do well out of that. But if you go back to January 2007, you would not find a single macroeconomic forecaster who would say that in 2 years' time the US is going to be in a very serious recession. You would not find analysts of banks and mortgage companies who would say, a couple of years, pretty much every institution that we're covering with our highly complex analysis is either going to be bankrupt or being rescued by the government. None of those guys had a clue, apart from, as I said, a very small number of people. But if you look at what trading systems did over that period, they didn't try and forecast what was going to happen anyway. But what they did do was kind of in 2008 say, well, it looks like the equity market is starting to go down, so we're going to go from being long equities to flat and then short equities and long bonds.
But hold on, as you say that, though, it looked like that in the context of a system. That wasn't just a gut feel that they pulled out. That was just like, that was the system that was, quote, feeling that.
Exactly, that was the system. So, in contrast, so, in early 2007, and I'm not trying to make myself out to be some kind of genius forecaster, because I've already said I don't think I'm good enough to be a discretionary trader. I think few people are. But, we were following the news around the mortgage-backed security markets and those Bear Stearns firms that went down in February 07, which was the very first emergence of the credit crisis. And I did say to a colleague I was working with, who was running the systematic equity fund, I really think we're going to see, massive sell-off in equities here. Although I was right, I was also incredibly early. I was about 18 months before the sell-off actually happened. And the difference between me and the trading system was the trading system carried on being long equities until much later when it saw the market turning and then automatically reversed its positions and then did incredibly well. So you kind of got three groups of or four groups of people. You got a large number of people who had no idea what was coming, and even well into the crisis, were still forecasting that there was going to be 5% earnings growth in banks year on year. Then you had a small number of people like Paulson who saw what was coming and were able to bet in such a way that they actually made money out of it. Then you had people like myself who saw what was coming, but not through any special skill necessarily, and weren't able to capitalize on it. And then you've got the trading systems that had no idea what was coming, didn't care, but just adjusted their positions according to the market movements as they came. The thing that really encapsulates it, and it's an anecdote I tell in my book, is the fact that in the sort of real middle of the crisis, so when AIG was going down and Lehman's was going down, and Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae were in trouble, we were as human beings sitting in our office, we were absolutely terrified and spent our days running around like headless chickens, going, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? The market's in a terrible mess. The world's going to end. And if we were human beings who'd been actually, making trading decisions, we probably would have just sold everything, bought gold bars, and just moved to Switzerland. And that wouldn't have been a bad trade. But because we were running a computer system, we kind of seriously asked ourselves, well, should we just turn this thing off? Is it safe to leave it running? And while this was happening, the computer system itself didn't know or care about us being scared, didn't know or care about all the bad news in the market, only in as much as it saw the price patterns and, put the appropriate position on. And 2008 was one of the best years for that fund ever. It was a real contrast between scared, emotional humans and, a computer system that had no emotions, was not scared, and just carried on doing what it had always done. The market moved, it put the appropriate amount of risk on. It didn't think, well, this is a really scary environment. It just scaled its positions according to the risk it saw in the market and was very profitable.
You lay out the good example of a systems trader, a system sticking with it in the face of utter chaos. Is there a negative to being a staunch systems trader? Staunch being a word that I've seen you use in your work.
There is a negative in the sense that, well, there's a couple of things. Firstly, I do believe that that there are some people who can do much better than a trading system can. So if you're a really amazing guy who can look at price patterns and flows in the market, and think about economic implications, and forecast things like like Paulson did, for example. You couldn't have made the short mortgage trade that Paulson did up to 2007 using a trading system, because you don't have that element of repeatability. The situation that we were in 2007, where we'd had house prices reach unprecedented levels, where we had this huge bubble of mortgage-backed debt, that was unprecedented. And, if it had happened once a year for the previous 30 years, then yes, you could have built a model that exploited that. So that's the first disadvantage. As a systems trader, you're never going to be as good as the very best discretionary traders. But, most of us aren't going to be the very best discretionary traders, so we should just forget about it and stick to a system. There is a second thing, which is there are very rare occasions when you do need to intervene with your trading system. And just a couple of examples from my career would be once there was going to be, or there was a coup in Thailand, and we knew there was a pretty good chance that they would suspend the convertibility of their currency and impose capital controls. So we kind of quickly shut down our positions in Thai baht, and the system didn't know about this. And it's not that we thought we could do a better job of forecasting what the price would do than the system could. It's just that we knew that trading that market would be impossible, and therefore we should just stop trading it as soon as possible. And the second situation was when one of our prime brokers, MF Global, got into serious trouble when John Corzine was sort of ran it into the ground. And again, we knew a few days in advance that was likely to happen. So, there were a few markets where we were trading with them as our sole prime broker. We had to get out of those positions, or risk being in a situation where we'd be losing client money. But I'm talking about two, and I could perhaps add 3 or 4 more times where over a 7-year career where it was the right thing to do to intervene with the system. But that's how rare it should be. I'm not talking about changing the system every month to see what your perception of risk is at the moment.
You mentioned the discretionary traders. Some of them being so exceptional, so much excellence. You mentioned John Paulson. I can think of a name like Michael Burry. Their way that they define risk would have to make most systems traders pretty nervous, because for as many Paulsons and Burrys as there are, of course, survivorship bias starts to play part of my thought process here. I want to say, well, who didn't get the timing right? Maybe they had the same idea as Paulson and Burry, but they didn't get the timing right, or at some other point in time in history, somebody took that kind of bet and they just became a footnote in history. It just seems like the risk for being an individual that gets classified as an excellent discretionary trader, the way that they classify risk seems much different than the systematic styles that you and I are talking about. Or am I completely wrong here?
Well, I think about the problem in a couple of different ways. So one is to take the view that Nassim Taleb takes in many of his books, which is if you were starting out your career and you sort of decided you were going to be a trader, should you go and be a discretionary trader or should you be a systematic trader? And I think if you're going to be a systematic trader, then you're likely to be able to earn, assuming you're trading your own money, an average of maybe 10 or 15% a year is I think is a reasonable expectation without taking on too much risk. Now, if you're an absolutely top of the line, discretionary trader, then you could probably increase that number many multiples. But the point is that 99.9% of the people who go down that route will probably fail. The high end is better, but the average and the dispersion is an awful lot worse. The second thing is that in terms of styles of trading, and this isn't really a systematic versus discretionary thing, it just comes down to different trading strategies and different return profiles. The kind of bets that Paulson was doing were bets where you take potentially a number of small losses for many years, and then you have huge outsized returns in 1 or 2 years. Now that's actually on the same kind of side of the playing field as trend following, where typically maybe 6 out of 10 months you'll lose money, but in the 4 months where you make money, you'll make much more and it all comes out ahead. So they're actually more alike than you might think. And that's quite distinct from, to use a technical term, a negative skew style of trading, like something like, FX carry or taking the other side of the John Paulson trade, where you're doing something like selling credit insurance every year and you get lots of small gains and you feel good, and then every few years, you have a huge loss and you get wiped out. The way that you think about risk management and the way that you think about the psychology of those two sides of the risk spectrum are quite different. But, the Paulson, lots of small bets, occasionally large payoffs, is more similar to trend following than it is to, the other side of the field where whether you're trading systematically or discretionary, you're getting lots of small gains, which psychologically feels better. But occasionally you're going to get these huge losses, and you have to risk manage your system carefully so that those huge losses don't wipe you out.
Should you have from your perspective, one trading rule for all markets, all instruments? Big question, lots of depth. You've written a book on this subject, so people are going to have to read it. So I'm only going to get a few minutes out of you on this.
In general, yes. So, if you look at things that are similar, so, I trade my own portfolio about 40 futures markets covering most asset classes, most countries. And the only distinction I make between them is the cost of trading that market. So I trade cheap markets quicker, and I trade slow markets I trade expensive markets slower. So something like, Australian interest rate futures, I trade really slowly because they're really expensive. Something like NASDAQ, I trade a little bit quicker. But the difference in fast and slow here is not that much. You're talking about maybe at one extreme a 2 to 3 week average holding period, and at the other extreme perhaps a 2-month holding period. So they're not that dissimilar. But on the other hand, would I use this set of trading rules to trade something completely different, like pairs of US equities? I'd probably use a different set of trading rules for those. But if you're talking about things that are fairly similar, then generally speaking, there isn't as much evidence to suggest that you should trade, say, UK pound versus US dollar currency futures differently from yen dollar currency futures, and even different again from US equity futures. You do see the data some differences, but they never really come out statistically significant. And this is actually a real hardening of my attitude to this subject, because if you go back 5 years when I was at AHL, I would have said that there was much more evidence, or it seemed to me at least that there were good reasons to trade different things differently, but now I kind of feel I don't really see the evidence for that. And I think especially as an individual investor who's doing your own research and doesn't have teams of people, you should do the absolute simplest possible thing that makes sense, and then only do something more complicated or fit it to different markets where you can find incredibly strong evidence that that's the right thing to do. And I rarely see that evidence looking at just futures markets.
Break apart. And I know this gets political when I mention his name for some people, but break apart Donald Rumsfeld's favorite descriptions: the predictable risks and the unpredictable risks, the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns. Break that apart, because I think sometimes people really don't allow themselves the time to think about what he was saying, which could sound kind of quick and cute and maybe political, but there was a lot of depth behind it.
Absolutely. So, risk is about unknowns. And if we knew what was going to happen next week, there would be no risk involved. But there are known unknowns and there are unknown unknowns. So getting away from Mr. Rumsfeld, I would call those predictable and unpredictable risks. To predict something, you need to have some kind of model. You need to have some way of deciding, what's going to happen. So you need sort of the mathematical functions, if you like, and then you need to feed into them some estimates of what you think the number should be in those mathematical functions. Really, the most simple thing you can do, perhaps not the most simple thing you can do, but a pretty simple thing to do would be to say, well, I think that all asset returns are, what a statistician would call normally distributed, and they have a particular standard deviation or variance, and they have a particular correlation. Without getting technical, what that means in practice is that you can summarize what you think will happen to asset returns with a relatively small number of variables. You can then kind of take things a step further and say, well, I don't think that this model predicts enough of the risk in the world. I want to make my model more complicated and introduce all kinds of other factors into that. And a lot of people who are working in the quantitative finance world, this is what they do for their jobs. They come up with more and more esoteric risk models. Now, the danger with that is that the more complicated your notion of what the predictable risk is, the less and less you think about the unpredictable risk. The less and less you think about what Nassim Taleb calls the black swans, the things that come from you completely from left field. I think a good example of this is going back to the credit crisis. There were these models to price mortgage securities using something called a copula. And a copula is, something that's pretty complicated. And I think it was sufficiently complicated that the people using those models assumed that this completely embodied the world. And they forgot that a model is just a model. It's a simplification of reality. It isn't reality. Now, my personal approach is to go to the opposite extreme and say, you know what, I'm going to use the simplest possible risk model I can, which is the one I described to you earlier. And then I'm going to know for sure that there's an awful lot of unpredictable stuff that's going to happen. I've always got that in the back of my mind, and I'm going to sort of always make sure that I limit as much as I can my exposure to that unpredictable risk. And by nature, it's unpredictable. So, if the S&P 500 dropped 80% in one day, which has never happened, and, it would expose me potentially to very large losses. But at least I have in the back of my mind that something like that could happen. Whereas if I was using a more sophisticated risk model, I think the danger is I'd be thinking too much about the known unknowns, and just kind of forgetting completely about the unknown unknowns, the unpredictable part of the risk model.
People are going to have to check out your work. Systematic Trading, a unique new method for designing trading and investing systems, is out now. They can find it everywhere, Amazon, all that kind of fun stuff.
Yeah, that's right. One of the best places to go is probably to www.systematictrading.org, and that's got a list of the contents and some more information about the book. And there's also links to sort of code and spreadsheets that you can use in conjunction with the book to design your own trading system.
Perhaps we can do this again in the future and kind of have part two, because I could definitely keep digging with you and go on for another hour easily.
Absolutely. Look forward to it.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.